Hello and welcome back, and today we're going to be doing another historical video. So today's topic is something that I'm really interested in because it's kind of about a part of a culture where two kind of cultures have sort of met together. It kind of ties in a lot to do with my heritage, considering my family have roots back to the Celts and a little bit from the Italians. And what it is we're going to be talking about is about gladiators and who they were and kind of where it comes from. So if you like all things historic and interesting, grab a drink, turn out the lights, it's going to get interesting. So gladiators actually predate the Roman Empire, even though that's where they were made most famous in. They're actually first mentioned in the Etruscan culture, which is the predecessors of the Italians. The mention of the gladiators in this culture were actually for ritualistic uses during burials and funerals where two people would fight, and the intention was to give the deceased armed attendance into the next world, and the bloodshed was actually seen as a good omen, and if there wasn't actually any blood that was drawn, it was seen as a bad omen and that the soul of the deceased would be damned into the next life. The word gladiator actually derives from the Latin word gladius, which means sword. The first Roman organised gladiator fight was in 264 BCE and was actually kept rather true to its original purpose for burial uses. However, the gladiators used in this particular ritual were actually slaves that were actually pitted against each other and forced to fight until the death. This would start a trend within the gladiator culture that would go on until the end of this particular reign many years later. Gradually over the first century of the Roman Empire, the use of gladiators would actually move away from the private use of burial rituals and actually go into entertainment for the public, which were displays that were put on by the local hierarchy in wealth as a display of their power and influence within that particular community. It was actually another way to increase their wealth, as they would charge a small fee for those attending these games, so they would expend their wealth and their influence. There are actually some advertisements that have survived in Pompeii to this day, and we now know that the advertisements would display the number of gladiators that would attend or be shown in those particular games, and we now know that the greater the number, the more fantastical and glamorous the spectacle would be. So Roman gladiators themselves would actually be slaves or criminals. A lot of them would not actually be of Roman blood, but would be people who were captured during the invasion of other countries. A great portion of these would have come from the ancient Britain and would have been Celts. Though the majority were slaves, there were a number of cases that weren't slaves, and I'll briefly touch on that a little bit later. When gladiator fights gained more interest and more popularity, specialist schools would be open to train these slaves and criminals in specific areas of fighting. Gladiators were actually separated into different class ranks, and this was based on their height, their stature, and their mode of fighting. So we have the Spanites, the Thracians, Mirmilones, Retiarius, Secutor, and Dapatei, Dimaceri, Esaderi, Hoplomachii, and Laqueri. Spanites were actually trained to fight with the national weapons of that time. This was a long oblong shield, a visor, a plumed helmet, and a short sword. The Thracians fought with a round buckle and a dagger like a scythe. The Mirmilones were actually armed in the Gallic fashion with a helmet, a sword, and a shield. The Retiarius, or netmen, specialised in using a net, a fork, and wore nothing but a tunic or an apron. And Dapatei fought on horse and wore helmets and a closed visor, so they would actually fight blind. Dimicaries, or two knife men, appeared in the later generation of the empire and carried two small swords. Esadari, or chariot men, were men who fought on chariot resembling the ancient Britons. Hoplomachii, or fighters in armour, which was very self-explanatory, wore full complete suits of armour. And the Laqueri lasso men their speciality were to try and lasso their opponent. Depending on which class they were divided into would determine which area they would be trained in. Some would be sent into other cities to these specialist schools that would train them in a very specialist field like chariot or horseback. Some of these schools were said to have been huge, almost as big as the Colosseums themselves, in order to have the space to train them on chariot and on horseback. Interestingly enough, those who ran these schools, known as the Ludos, were well known, but the actual occupation itself was seen as quite disgraceful. Due to this, most of the people who did run these schools were retired gladiators who wanted to still earn some money. During their time at the school, gladiators would actually train in front of live crowds, and sometimes this could be up to 3,000 people watching. This would help give them the real idea of what it would be like in the real arena, but it also quenched the thirst of those wanting to watch when there were no games being held. Because this was seen as a profession and they were professionally trained, gladiators were very expensive to house, feed and train, and all costs would be paid for by sponsors or promoters, and so they didn't really want to see them be killed needlessly. It's due to this, it's believed that a lot of the trainers would actually train them to wound rather than kill. The games would actually begin with a procession through the arena of the gladiators that would be performing in those games that day, and it would be followed by a sham fight, and this was a fight that would use wooden swords and javelins, and then the actual games would be announced by a trumpet. During this time, if any of the contestants were to show fear or any hesitation, they would actually be chased out into the arena for the first match, regardless if it was their round or not, with whips and hot iron. The fights themselves would actually end when one of the contestants were wounded or unable to fight. A sign of mercy would be given, and then that particular contestant would wait for the sign or the verdict from the crowd of their fate. If the crowd wanted them to survive, they would wave handkerchiefs or pieces of cloth to show that for their favour. If they desired the death of them, they would usually do a hand motion. This particular hand motion was made very popular in Hollywood films as a downward thumb motion, though historians believe that it possibly wasn't actually that motion. It could be any motion to do with the hand. If this was the case, the gladiators were trained to not beg for mercy and to not ask to be spared. They would actually train to die with honour. They would raise their chins and wait for the other contestant to come and slit their throats. For those who died in combat, the trainer or the Lannister might actually demand a charge of the sponsor of that particular fatal spectacle, nearly 100 times the cost of the actual gladiator that had survived. It was possible for some gladiators to actually come to a draw, and there is a really big famous case of this. This was during the reign of Titus, and he actually attended this particular match, and it was a match between Priscus and Versus. It was said that the actual match lasted for hours, and in the end they both collapsed at the same time from exhaustion, and they put on such a spectacle and such a show that Titus has actually granted them both winners and a draw, and they will both actually gained their freedom from this. Despite the games being popular demand and very much a part of the Roman Empire culture, most gladiators would only fight a few times a year and could actually go with a year-long gap between each fight. This was also another way to ensure the sponsors' money would be kept safe and to prevent them from dying and then losing their money. Those who'd be victorious within the matches would actually be granted branches of palm and sometimes money. After numerous victories, usually it would be around 15, he could actually be discharged from any future service and actually gain his freedom. Though some of them would choose to go on to re-engage in the gladiator lifestyle, as it was seen as a good profession to have, as you would get some regular income. Those who were in the same class as each other would have actually trained together and would have got to know each other very, very well during their training and would have become very, very close. Another reason why they wouldn't want to kill each other and only would have tried to wound each other. But despite this, the life expectancy of the gladiator was incredibly young. Most would only survive into their early to mid-20s. Because of this, historians have speculated that only 1 in 5 to 1 in every 10 occasions of these games that someone would actually die. Despite the fact of having short lives, some gladiators would actually go on to become famous and political influences. Many of this was because a lot of the wealthy men of the time would have bodyguards consisting of gladiators from the arena. Not only that, they were seen as somewhat celebrities of their times and was said to have the choice of most upper society women for them to have. Sometimes, some gladiators would actually act on their own initiative, and a great example of this was the case of Spartacus between 73 to 71 BC. Due to the uprising of Spartacus, more vigorous training in discipline and as well as an oath was then enacted within the gladiator schools in order to tie them to the Roman Empire to stop them from turning against them. In some of these gladiator schools, some of the gladiators would actually form unions or collegia with their own elected leaders and their own specific deities. What this would mean was when someone from that particular school would fall in battle, this particular union would ensure that they would receive a proper burial and actually give them a tombstone or a headstone with a respectful engraving of all of their achievements within the particular arena that they fought in. If those particular people actually had spouses or children, they would also ensure that they would also receive some money as compensation for their loss as well. Despite many popular belief, the role of the gladiator wasn't just for men. Women could also be gladiators, and during the reign of some particular emperors, including Domitian, women were actually more popular than male gladiators. Some of these female fighters actually proved themselves rather highly within this patriarchal society, as there is actually a marble monument within Italy dedicated to some of the female fighters known as Amazon. As I mentioned before, it wasn't just always slaves and criminals. Sometimes some particular men who had fallen in disgrace, usually from high societies, would also enter into the gladiator ring in order to gain some respect back. Some soldiers who had got themselves into debt was also a great way for them to clear their debt, and even the odd emperor had stepped into the arena to prove themselves. Despite the depiction in Hollywood, the use of animals wasn't really that common within the arena, and even then it was only for a very specialist class of gladiator, known as venatores or bestiari. And even with that, it wasn't always lion. It could be anything from deer to ostriches to crocodiles to bears, and at some points even an elephant. When animal hunts were actually used, they would usually open the games after the sham fight in order to open up the games, and sometimes some convicted criminals and Christians would actually be thrown into the ring just before the hunt would start to be fed to the animals in order to rile them up. When Christianity began to dominate the Roman Empire, the gladiator culture began to fall out of favour, and Emperor Constantine I would actually be the first person to try and ban the culture of gladiators and try and abolish the games completely in 325 AD. But this wasn't to much success, as it wouldn't be until Honorius between 393 and 423 AD would come along and completely abolish the culture by shutting down the gladiator schools. Despite this though, many criminals were still put into the gladiator ring in order to be convicted and to be killed off by some of the animals. Many of the Roman civilians would lament over the loss of such an important part of their culture and such an important part of the pastime that had become such a massive fabric of their lives. But all things Roman would be coming to an end, as only 6 years later the Visigoths, led by Alaric I, would actually ransack the Eternal City itself, and the fall of the Roman Empire would actually come, and the whole Roman Empire culture would come to an end. So there you have it, guys. There's my rundown of gladiators and who they were, where they came from, and what it was to be a gladiator. I find this particular topic very fascinating. As I say, I have some heritage in both the Italian culture from many generations ago, but the majority of my culture is actually Celt, and the fact that a lot of these gladiators would be Celtic is completely fascinating to me, as one of the biggest parts of the Roman culture was heavily Celtic influenced, I guess you could say. Well, not influenced, but used the Celts, and they were actually just as important to the Roman culture as the Romans themselves were. And for me, I find that incredibly fascinating, and how two of the heritage of my family kind of tie into each other, and how it kind of explains much more of how those two cultures and my particular heritage may have met. Well, let me know what you think of that in the comments below, guys, and if you want me to expand more on that, or if you want me to do anything else to do with the Roman Empire, I will happily talk about that. I will be talking about the fall of the Roman Empire and who it was that actually caused the fall of the Roman Empire in another video. But do let me know what you think in the comments below. As for me, a blessing for me. As for me, as a blessing for me, may your house always smell of fresh baking and be filled with the sound of music. And until next time, I hope you have a great week, and I will see you on the flip side. Bye!